In the first week of December 1941, the temperature outside Moscow dropped to -35 degrees Celsius, and the German Army Group Center, which had been promised it would be sleeping in Moscow's hotels by autumn, discovered that its tank engines would not start. The lubricants had frozen solid. The soldiers, still wearing the summer uniforms they had been issued for what was supposed to be a 6-week campaign, wrapped themselves in stolen curtains and tablecloths and newspapers, did anything to keep the cold from killing them before the Soviets did. Frostbite was taking more men out of action than enemy bullets, rifles jammed, bread had to be cut with saws. And then, on December 5th, 100 fresh Soviet divisions that German intelligence had confidently declared did not exist, came screaming out of the snow and smashed into the German line across a 200-mile front. The Wehrmacht, which had not been forced into a major retreat in 2 years of war, began to retreat. Officers who had been planning their victory parades found themselves fighting for survival. It was not yet the end. But something had shifted in those frozen fields outside Moscow. Some foundational assumption had cracked open, and through that crack, an enormous amount of future catastrophe would pour. The question of how Germany lost the Second World War is one of those problems that appears simple at a distance and becomes bewilderingly complex up close. The simple version is seductive. Germany was outproduced, outnumbered, and fighting on too many fronts against too many enemies. All of that is true. But it is true in the way that saying a patient died of organ failure is true, technically correct and analytically useless. It does not tell you what went wrong, or when, or why the patient refused treatment when treatment was still possible. Germany did not simply run out of tanks, it ran out of options. And it ran out of options because of a cascading series of strategic decisions, institutional pathologies, and ideological commitments that compounded on each other over 4 years until the machine that had conquered France in 6 weeks could not defend its own capital. To understand how that happened, really understand it, not just recite the timeline, you have to go back before the first shot was fired and look at the thing Germany actually built. Not the propaganda image of a perfectly synchronized war machine humming with Teutonic efficiency, but the real thing, which was stranger, more fragile, and more self-destructive than almost anyone understood at the time or, for that matter, for decades afterward. The Germany that went to war in September 1939 was not ready for the war it was about to fight. This is one of the great ironies of the entire conflict. The regime that had staked everything on military revival, that had poured resources into rearmament at a pace that warped the entire economy and alarmed every treasury official who could still read a balance sheet that had made martial prowess the centerpiece of its national mythology. That regime went to war with an army that was designed, at its core, for short, sharp campaigns against isolated opponents. The German military buildup of the 1930s was real and impressive in certain dimensions, but it was also shallow in ways that mattered enormously. The Luftwaffe had a superb tactical air force, fast bombers, dive bombers, fighters designed to support ground operations, and almost no strategic bombing capability, no capacity to wage the kind of sustained air campaign against an enemy's industrial base that would prove decisive later in the war. The Army had excellent panzer divisions, perhaps 10 that could be called truly elite, and the rest of the force was infantry that moved on foot and relied on horses for supply. Roughly 600,000 horses by 1941, which is not a detail you will find featured prominently in documentaries about the Wehrmacht's fearsome modernity. The Navy was a rump force that Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, a cautious and competent bureaucratic survivor, had told Hitler flatly would not be ready for a major war until 1945 at the earliest. The entire rearmament program had been structured around the assumption that Germany would fight a series of limited wars, Poland first, then perhaps France, with breathing room between them to rebuild, re-equip, and digest what had been gained. What it was emphatically not designed for was a simultaneous multi-front, years-long war of attrition against the 3 largest industrial economies on the planet. which is, of course, precisely the war Adolf Hitler delivered. The early victories obscured every one of these weaknesses, and they obscured them so effectively that some of the myths they generated persist to this day. Poland fell in 5 weeks. Norway was taken in a daring combined operation that caught the British flat-footed. And then France, the country that had bled Germany white for 4 grinding years in the previous war, the country whose army was considered the finest in Europe, the country that had built the Maginot Line as a concrete and steel guarantee that 1914 would never happen again, collapsed in 6 weeks in the spring of 1940. The result was so shocking that it surprised the German high command almost as much as it surprised the French. There is a famous story, possibly apocryphal but emotionally true, that when the news of the French armistice reached Hitler's headquarters, he slapped his thigh with delight like a child who had gotten away with something. The fall of France is one of the most consequential military events of the 20th century, and it was also one of the most misleading because it convinced Hitler and a significant portion of the German leadership that they had discovered a new way of war, a way that could overcome material disadvantages through speed, audacity, and the sheer operational brilliance of the German officer corps. The Panzer breakthrough at Sedan, Heinz Guderian's mad dash to the English Channel, the encirclement of the entire Allied northern wing at Dunkirk. It was genuinely revolutionary warfare. But it worked against a French army that was psychologically brittle, strategically passive, and deployed in exactly the wrong posture to meet the kind of attack it received. It worked, in other words, against an opponent that cooperated with its own destruction. Then the lesson Hitler drew from this, that willpower and operational daring could substitute for industrial depth, was exactly the wrong lesson. And he would spend the next 5 years trying to replicate the miracle of 1940 against enemies who refused to cooperate. There is a version of this story in which Britain's refusal to come to terms after the fall of France is the first crack in the German strategic edifice, and that version has considerable merit. Why Hitler had expected the British to negotiate once France was gone. He had no plan for what to do if they didn't. Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain, was never a serious military undertaking. The German Navy lacked the landing craft, the Luftwaffe failed to achieve the air superiority that would have been a prerequisite, and the whole enterprise had an air of improvisation that betrayed its fundamental unseriousness. The Battle of Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940 was the first campaign the Wehrmacht did not win, and while it did not come close to defeating Germany, it did something arguably more important. It kept an unsinkable aircraft carrier and staging base positioned off the coast of continental Europe, from which, eventually, an invasion force would be launched. Britain's survival meant that Germany would always have an enemy at its back, an enemy that could not be reached, where an enemy that was drawing in resources from a global empire and, increasingly, from the industrial colossus across the Atlantic. Winston Churchill, that extraordinary combination of strategic vision and reckless overconfidence, understood this with perfect clarity. Britain could not win the war alone, but it could survive long enough for the correlation of forces to shift, and that survival was itself a form of strategic victory. The decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, was the moment the war became unwinnable for Germany, though it would take another year of fighting before the structural impossibility of the position became apparent even to those willing to look at the evidence honestly. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition and its arrogance. 3 million German and Axis soldiers, the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history. It would drive into the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, a distance of roughly 1,800 miles, destroy the Red Army in a series of massive encirclement battles west of the Dvina-Dnieper river line, and force a political collapse of the Soviet state before winter set in. The entire operational concept rested on a single enormous assumption, that the Soviet Union was, as Hitler put it in one of his more colorful formulations, a rotten structure that would come crashing down once the door was kicked in. The planning documents gave the campaign 5 months. 5 months to conquer a country that spanned 11 time zones. The logistics staff at OKH, the Army High Command, when they actually ran the numbers, concluded that German supply lines would become unsustainable beyond a depth of approximately 500 kilometers from the start line. The planners acknowledged this inconvenient finding, and noted it carefully in their reports, and then proceeded with the invasion as though it would not matter, because the war would be over by then. This was not a plan in any meaningful strategic sense. It was a bet, the largest and most reckless bet in military history. For the first several months, the bet appeared to be paying off at a rate that staggered even the optimists. The initial German advances were some of the most devastating military operations ever executed. At Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev, entire Soviet army groups were encircled and destroyed in battles of annihilation that had no precedent in modern warfare. The Kiev encirclement alone netted over 600,000 Soviet prisoners. By October 1941, the Wehrmacht had captured or killed over 3 million Soviet soldiers, destroyed or captured tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft, and advanced to within sight of Moscow's church spires. The Soviet state appeared to be in its death throes, and in Washington and London, serious people were calculating how to deal with a world in which Germany controlled everything from the Atlantic to the Urals. But 3 things were happening simultaneously beneath the surface of these spectacular victories. 3 developments that the German command structure was poorly equipped to see, let alone address, and each of them was quietly destroying the foundations on which the entire campaign rested. First, the Red Army, despite suffering losses that would have caused any Western army to sue for peace, was not collapsing politically. This was perhaps the single greatest intelligence failure of the war. The German leadership had convinced itself that the Soviet state was held together by terror alone and that the first major shock would shatter it. They were wrong. Stalin's regime was brutal, certainly. The NKVD blocking detachments behind the front lines were not a myth, but the patriotic response to the invasion was genuine and deep, rooted in a combination of Russian nationalism, genuine horror at the conduct of the German occupation, and a totalitarian mobilization capacity that the Western democracies could barely comprehend, let alone match. The Soviet system, for all its grotesque inefficiencies and murderous internal politics, turned out to be capable of absorbing punishment on a scale that no one, including many Soviet leaders, had believed possible. Second, the Soviets were already beginning the extraordinary feat of industrial evacuation, the relocation of over 1,500 major factories from Western Russia to the Urals, to Siberia, to Central Asia, an operation that involved dismantling entire industrial complexes, loading them onto trains, shipping them thousands of miles east, and reassembling them in open fields where workers lived in tents and dugouts while they rebuilt the machines that would rebuild the army. This evacuation has no parallel in industrial history. It was chaotic, wasteful, and staggeringly costly in human terms. It also worked. Within a year, those relocated factories were producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition in quantities that matched and then exceeded German output. The T-34 tank, a machine that combined ruggedness, firepower, and ease of manufacture in a way that no German tank could match on the production line, began rolling off assembly lines in the Urals in numbers that made German planners physically ill when they saw the intelligence reports. Third, and most immediately lethal, the Wehrmacht itself was bleeding out. Not in the dramatic, visible way of a single catastrophic defeat, but in the slow, grinding hemorrhage of a campaign that never ended. Every mile of advance stretched supply lines thinner. On every battle consumed men and equipment that could not be replaced at the rate they were being lost. By December 1941, the German army on the Eastern Front had suffered over 700,000 casualties, roughly 20% of its entire invasion force, and it had no adequate system for making good these losses. The replacement army, the Ersatzheer, was already scraping the bottom of its trained manpower reserves. The war was 5 months old, and the math was already turning lethal. That Germany was fighting a war of attrition, the one kind of war it could not afford to fight. And it was losing the attrition equation by a margin that widened with every passing month. Here, I want to pause and introduce a framework that I think is essential for understanding not just the fact that Germany lost, but why it lost in the specific way it did, grinding forward for 3.5 more years after the war was already structurally unwinnable, consuming millions of additional lives in the process. The framework is this: Germany's defeat was not primarily a story of battlefield failure. German soldiers fought with extraordinary skill and tenacity from the first day of the war to the last. The defeat was a story of systemic incoherence, a political system that was structurally incapable of the kind of rational, centralized strategic coordination that a total war on this scale absolutely demanded. The Third Reich was not, despite its terrifying reputation, a highly efficient totalitarian state. It was a chaotic, overlapping, internally competitive tangle of rival power centers, party organs, military branches, industrial fiefdoms, SS empires, regional satrapies, all competing for Hitler's favor, and all operating under a leader who deliberately encouraged that competition, because it kept any single institution from becoming powerful enough to challenge his authority. This was not a bug in the system. It was the system. It was how Hitler ruled. He gave overlapping mandates to competing subordinates: Göring and Speer over armaments production, the Army and the SS over military operations, Ribbentrop and Rosenberg and Himmler over the governance of occupied territories, and let them fight it out in a Darwinian struggle that he alone could arbitrate. The result was an institutional landscape that looked, from the outside, like a monolithic dictatorship operating with ruthless efficiency, and functioned, on the inside, like a medieval court riddled with faction, intrigue, and catastrophic duplication of effort. And this mattered enormously for the conduct of the war, because a total war fought on multiple fronts across thousands of miles is, above all else, a management problem. It is a problem of allocating scarce resources: men, steel, fuel, aluminum, rolling stock, engineering talent, factory floor space, across competing demands that all seem urgent. And the German system was catastrophically bad at this, not because the individual managers were incompetent. Many of them were extraordinarily capable people operating under impossible conditions, but because the system itself was designed, from its very architecture, to prevent the kind of centralized, rational, dispassionate allocation that the military situation required. Consider the production of fighter aircraft, which serves as a devastating case study in how institutional dysfunction translates into battlefield defeat. By 1943, Germany desperately, overwhelmingly, existentially needed fighters. The Allied strategic bombing offensive was gaining momentum. American B-17 were hitting industrial targets by day. British Lancasters were burning cities by night. The rational response was obvious to anyone who could read a production chart: shift manufacturing massively toward fighter aircraft at the expense of bombers, transport planes, and everything else. But Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarschall, head of the Luftwaffe, and one of the most powerful political figures in the Reich, had staked his personal prestige on the bomber force and on offensive air operations. Göring was a man of considerable political cunning, the genuine charm when he chose to deploy it, and almost no technical understanding of modern air warfare. A World War I fighter ace who had been living off that credential for a quarter century while his physical and mental capacities deteriorated under the influence of morphine addiction, megalomania, and sheer indolence. He surrounded himself with sycophants, ignored subordinates who brought bad news, and made decisions based on what would preserve his political standing rather than what would preserve the Luftwaffe's combat effectiveness. He resisted the shift to fighters because admitting that Germany needed fighters was admitting that Germany had lost control of its own skies, which was admitting that he, Hermann Göring, had failed. So the shift happened late, happened incompletely, and happened in the chaotic context of competing production programs that were constantly being reshuffled as Hitler himself intervened with new directives based on whatever weapon or technology had captured his imagination that particular week. The saga of the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, crystallizes this dysfunction with almost unbearable clarity. The aircraft was a genuine technological marvel, significantly faster than any Allied fighter, yet capable of giving Germany a real edge in the air defense battle that was becoming the war's central front. The fighter commanders begged for it. Adolf Hitler, the brilliant and increasingly desperate general of the fighter arm, argued passionately that massing jet interceptors against the Allied bomber streams could change the calculus of the air war. But Hitler, fixated on the coming Allied invasion of France, insisted that the Me-262 be developed primarily as a fast bomber, a blitz bomber that could strike at invasion beaches at speeds no Allied fighter could match. The result was months of delay, redesign, and bureaucratic warfare as the aircraft was modified to carry bombs it was never meant to carry, while the Allied bombers continued to methodically dismantle German industry from above. By the time the Me-262 reached operational fighter squadrons in meaningful numbers in late 1944 and early 1945, the pilots to fly them were barely trained teenagers, the fuel to run the jet engines was being rationed by the cupful, and the airfields they operated from were under constant Allied attack. A weapon that might have mattered in 1943 was deployed too late to matter at all. This pattern, the correct decision, identified by competent people, arrived at too late, implemented too incompletely, sabotaged by institutional politics and the caprice of a dictator who could not be overruled, repeats with almost mechanical regularity across every domain of the German war effort. Albert Speer, who took over armaments production in February 1942 after Fritz Todt died in a plane crash that has never been entirely explained, managed a genuinely remarkable increase in German weapons output through rationalization, standardization, and a ruthless willingness to override the peacetime business practices that German industry had clung to with remarkable tenacity. German tank production tripled between 1942 and 1944. Aircraft production soared. Ammunition output reached levels that the pre-war planners had considered impossible. But Speer, who was not the apolitical technocrat he later claimed to be, but was certainly an effective manager, was fighting a constant bureaucratic war on multiple fronts simultaneously. Against Göring, who controlled a rival production empire through the Luftwaffe's own manufacturing apparatus. Against the SS, which under Himmler was building an industrial network of its own, using concentration camp slave labor in conditions of such brutality that productivity was a fraction of what free workers could achieve. Against the Gauleiter, the regional party bosses who hoarded labor and materials for their own construction projects and prestige schemes. Against Fritz Sauckel, the labor plenipotentiary whose forced labor recruitment in occupied Europe was generating resistance movements faster than it was generating workers. And against Hitler himself, who had an almost pathological attraction to wonder weapons and grand technological projects. The V-2 rocket, the super heavy tanks, the jet aircraft, the submarine types that were always 6 months from readiness, at the expense of the mundane but critical work of producing enough standard rifles, standard shells, and standard trucks to keep existing frontline units operational. The German fixation on qualitative superiority over quantitative adequacy was not merely a production philosophy. It was an expression of the regime's deepest ideological convictions, the belief that German quality, German will, a German racial genius could overcome mere numbers, that one Tiger tank crewed by Aryan warriors was worth 5 of anything the Slavic hordes could produce. For every Tiger that rolled off the Henschel production line, a formidable machine, unquestionably, with an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a mile. The Soviets were producing 5 T-34s, a tank that was mechanically simpler, dramatically cheaper, more reliable in the field, easier to repair, and perfectly adequate for the job it needed to do. The Tiger required 25 times the man-hours to build. It broke down constantly. Its fuel consumption was prodigious. Its sheer weight, 57 tons, meant it could not cross many bridges and frequently bogged down in the mud that was a seasonal feature of the Eastern Front. It was a masterpiece of engineering and a catastrophe of strategic resource allocation. The Germans kept building it because they could not bring themselves to accept what the production numbers were telling them, that in a war of industrial attrition, good enough in sufficient quantity beats magnificent in insufficient quantity every single time. And the production numbers by 1943 were telling a story that admitted of no optimistic interpretation. The combined industrial output of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire dwarfed Germany's by a ratio that made the eventual military outcome, in purely material terms, something close to a mathematical certainty. The United States alone, an economy that had not yet reached full wartime mobilization in 1942, was producing more combat aircraft in 1943 than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship, on average, every single day, replacing merchant tonnage faster than the U-boats could sink it. The Soviet Union, despite losing its most industrialized Western regions in the first year of the war and suffering civilian and military losses on a scale that staggers comprehension, was outproducing Germany in tanks, artillery pieces, and ammunition by margins that grew wider with each quarter. And Britain, smaller in industrial scale than either of its major allies, was contributing a strategic bomber force that was forcing Germany to divert enormous resources: fighters, anti-aircraft guns, radar networks, searchlight batteries, hundreds of thousands of trained personnel into homeland defense rather than reinforcing the Eastern Front, which was where the war would ultimately be decided. The Allied coalition was not some frictionless partnership of perfect cooperation. It was riven with genuine strategic disagreements, national rivalries, personal animosities, and fundamental differences in war aims that would eventually produce the Cold War. Churchill and Roosevelt disagreed about the timing and location of the cross-channel invasion. Stalin suspected, not without some justification, that his Western allies were content to let the Soviet Union bear the heaviest burden of the ground war. The combined chiefs of staff meetings involved bitter arguments that sometimes brought the Anglo-American alliance to the edge of rupture. But the coalition possessed something that Germany fundamentally lacked: a mechanism for strategic coordination that, however imperfect and contentious, it actually produced coherent decisions about the allocation of resources across theaters. The Lend-Lease pipeline that poured American trucks, locomotives, food, and raw materials into the Soviet Union, over 400,000 Studebaker trucks alone, which became the logistical backbone of the Red Army's great offensives of 1943 and 1944, was not charity. It was strategic investment, and it worked. The combined bomber offensive, for all its moral horror and its contested effectiveness, to force Germany into a two-front air war it could not sustain. The coordination of the Normandy invasion with Soviet offensives in the East, imperfect, sometimes poorly timed but real, ensured that Germany could never concentrate its remaining strength on a single front. Germany had nothing equivalent to any of this. Germany had Hitler. And by 1943, having Hitler was not an asset, it was a terminal liability. The question of Hitler's personal culpability in the defeat, as distinct from the structural factors that made defeat likely regardless, is one of the most contested issues in the historiography, and it deserves more precision than it usually receives. The post-war German generals, writing their memoirs from Allied prisoner-of-war camps with one eye on their own reputations and the other on the emerging Cold War that made their cooperation with the West strategically valuable, did constructed a narrative of remarkable durability. Hitler was the problem. The corporal had overridden the professionals. If only the generals had been left to run the war according to sound military principles, Germany might have achieved a negotiated peace, perhaps even some version of victory. This narrative is, in its strongest form, self-serving nonsense. The generals were enthusiastic participants in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, personally approved the logistics estimates for Barbarossa that assumed the campaign would be wrapped up in 4 months. Erich von Manstein, the supposed operational genius, produced plans of great elegance and never once proposed a realistic strategy for ending the war on terms that Germany could actually survive. The generals shared Hitler's fundamental delusion, the belief that operational brilliance could compensate for strategic reality, and they clung to it long after the evidence had become overwhelming. That said, and this is where precision matters, Hitler's specific interventions did make things measurably, quantifiably worse, and they made things worse in ways that can be traced with considerable confidence through the documentary record. His compulsive refusal to authorize tactical retreats, which began with a stand-fast order outside Moscow in December 1941 and hardened into rigid doctrine as the war progressed, cost the Wehrmacht hundreds of thousands of men in avoidable encirclements and last-stand defenses of positions that had no strategic value. Stalingrad is the most famous and most devastating example. Friedrich Paulus and his Sixth Army were encircled in November 1942 by a massive Soviet pincer operation, Operation Uranus, that German intelligence had detected in advance and that Paulus's own staff had warned about with increasing urgency. A breakout was feasible in the first weeks after encirclement. Manstein, commanding the relief force from outside the pocket, urged it. Paulus wanted authorization for it, but Hitler forbade it, partly because Göring, with a recklessness that bordered on criminal insanity, had assured the Führer that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped army by air, a promise that required delivering 300 tons of supplies per day when the actual average never exceeded 90, and partly because Hitler could not psychologically tolerate the idea of voluntarily surrendering the city that bore his rival dictator's name. The result was the destruction of an entire field army. When the pocket finally collapsed in early February 1943, approximately 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity. Fewer than 6,000 would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad was a catastrophe that did not need to happen at the scale at which it happened. And it happened because the command architecture of the German state concentrated final decision-making authority in a single individual who was increasingly detached from operational reality, increasingly surrounded by subordinates who feared to challenge him, and increasingly unwilling to process information that contradicted his wishes. But here's the uncomfortable analytical truth that the Hitler lost the war narrative tends to obscure, and it is a truth that must be confronted honestly if the question of Germany's defeat is to be understood in its full complexity. Even a hypothetical Germany led by a perfectly rational strategic actor, making optimal decisions at every juncture, Manus would still have faced the fundamental structural problem of waging a multi-front war against a coalition that collectively outproduced it by factors of 3, 4, and 5 to 1. Better decisions at Stalingrad, a more rational allocation of aircraft production, a timely withdrawal to shorter defensive lines, these might have prolonged the war. They would not have changed its outcome. The question, after December 1941, at the very latest, when Hitler declared war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor, an act of strategic lunacy that added the world's largest industrial economy to his list of active enemies for no compensating gain whatsoever, was never whether Germany would lose. The question was when and how completely, and how much of Europe and its people would be destroyed in the interval between the point at which defeat became inevitable and the point at which defeat was finally accepted. The year 1943 was when the architecture of that inevitable defeat became visible to anyone willing to look. In February, the Stalingrad pocket surrendered. In May, the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic, Germany's most promising strategic weapon, for its best hope for severing the supply lines that connected Britain to its American arsenal, suffered what Karl Dönitz, the submarine commander who had staked his career and his fleet on the tonnage war, called Black May. 41 U-boats were lost in a single month as Allied convoy escorts, long-range patrol aircraft, Improved radar and ultra-signals intelligence combined to turn the predators into prey. In July, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Citadel at Kursk, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front, hurling nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns against Soviet defensive positions that were, for once in the war, expecting the attack, prepared for it with a depth of fortification that consumed German armor at unsustainable rates. Kursk was the largest armored battle in history, and it ended in a German withdrawal, not a rout. For the Wehrmacht was still a formidable force that could extract a terrible price in defense, but a withdrawal from which the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front would never return. After Kursk, the Red Army attacked and kept attacking in an unbroken sequence of offensives that would not end until Soviet soldiers were standing in the ruins of the Reichstag. Meanwhile, the Allied strategic bombing campaign was tightening around Germany like a slowly closing fist. In the Hamburg firestorm of late July 1943, Operation Gomorrah killed over 37,000 civilians in a single week and created a fire tornado of such intensity that it generated winds strong enough to uproot trees and suck people into the flames from hundreds of yards away. Albert Speer, touring the devastation, told Hitler that 6 more attacks of that magnitude against critical industrial cities would collapse German war production entirely. The 6 attacks did not come in rapid succession. The Allies lacked the precision and the concentration to deliver them, but the mere threat of them forced Germany into a massive and crippling defensive commitment. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns that could have been deployed as anti-tank weapons on the Eastern Front, hundreds of thousands of personnel manning searchlights and radar stations and fire brigades, fighter squadrons pulled from the front to defend the homeland. The 88mm gun, Germany's finest anti-tank weapon and one of the best artillery pieces of the war, spent much of the conflict pointing upward instead of forward, because the cities were burning and someone had to try to stop it. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, opened the Continental Second Front that Germany could least afford and had most feared. The Atlantic Wall, the fortification system that Erwin Rommel had been frantically trying to strengthen since taking over its inspection in late 1943, was formidable in some sectors and disturbingly thin in others, a reflection of the same resource constraints and competing priorities that plagued every aspect of the German war effort. But the fundamental German problem in the West was not fortification. It was a disagreement at the highest levels of command about basic defensive strategy that was never resolved, only papered over with a compromise that gave neither side what it needed. Rommel, whose experience in North Africa had taught him what Allied air power could do to forces moving in the open, wanted the Panzer reserves positioned close to the beaches for an immediate counterattack on the day of the invasion, because he understood with painful clarity that once the Allies established a beachhead and began pouring in reinforcements under an umbrella of total air superiority, the chance to push them back into the sea would be gone forever. Gerd von Rundstedt, but the theater commander, an aristocratic old-school strategist who thought in terms of operational maneuver rather than beach defense, wanted the Panzer reserves held well back from the coast in a centralized mobile reserve that would be committed only once the main Allied landing site had been definitively identified. The compromise was that some Panzer divisions went forward and some were held back, lat denner bakwidipen, tu. And several of the most critical armored formations, including the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division, 2 of the best-equipped units in the West, could not move without Hitler's personal authorization. On the morning of June 6th, that authorization was not forthcoming because Hitler's staff officers were afraid to wake him. He slept until noon. By the time the panzers were released, the moment for a coordinated counterattack against the beaches had passed. The invasion succeeded not because the Allies faced negligible opposition. The carnage at Omaha Beach should permanently dispel that notion, but because the German response was fragmented, delayed, and crippled by a command structure that could not make decisions at the speed the situation required. From the summer of 1944 onward, the war entered its final grinding asymmetric phase. a phase in which Germany's remaining advantages, such as they were progressively overwhelmed by the sheer mass, coordination, and material abundance of the Allied advance from both directions. In the east, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration on June 23, 1944, almost exactly 3 years after Barbarossa, and the offensive destroyed Army Group Center, the same formation that had stood outside Moscow in the winter of 1941. The scale of the disaster was larger than Stalingrad. 28 German divisions were effectively annihilated. If the Soviets advanced 400 miles in 5 weeks. It was one of the most decisive operations of the entire war, and it received and continues to receive a fraction of the attention that Western historiography lavishes on Normandy, which occurred in the same month, a disproportion that says more about who wrote the histories than about what mattered on the battlefield. In the West, the breakout from the Normandy bocage in late July and August 1944 produced an Allied advance so rapid that for a few dizzying weeks in September, it appeared the war might end before Christmas. It did not, partly because Eisenhower's broad front strategy stretched Allied logistics beyond their breaking point. The armies were still being supplied over beaches and through the single functioning port of Cherbourg, and partly because the Wehrmacht, even in extremis, it could still generate ferocious resistance when compressed into shorter defensive lines with its back to the German border. Hitler's final strategic gamble, the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge, was a perfect crystallization of every pathology that had brought Germany to this point. The concept was pure 1940 nostalgia, a concentrated panzer thrust through the forested Ardennes, but aimed at splitting the British and American armies and capturing the vital port of Antwerp, thereby disrupting Allied supply lines so severely that the Western coalition would fracture and seek a separate peace. It was audacious, it was operationally bold, and it was completely, almost hallucinogenically, detached from the military reality of December 1944. The forces allocated were inadequate for the objective. The fuel supply was so short that the operational plan literally depended on the attacking forces capturing intact Allied fuel dumps along their route of advance, which is to say, the plan for fueling the offensive was to hope. The Luftwaffe could not guarantee air cover for more than the first few days. The infantry divisions packed into the assault formations were a pale shadow of the troops that had attacked through the same forests in 1940. Many were understrength, undertrained, and filled with older men and boys who had been conscripted in the desperate final mobilizations. The initial surprise was genuine, and for several anxious days the offensive created real alarm in Allied headquarters. Eisenhower's intelligence staff had missed the German buildup almost entirely. But the weather cleared. The Allied air forces returned in overwhelming strength. The fuel ran out. And American units, particularly the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, held critical road junctions with a tenacity that disrupted the German timetable beyond recovery. By late January, the offensive had collapsed, having consumed Germany's last meaningful operational reserves in the West for precisely zero strategic gain. The men and tanks and fuel burned up in the Ardennes could have strengthened the defense of the Rhine or been shifted east to slow the Soviet advance. Instead, they were gone, sacrificed on the altar of a fantasy. The final months of the war were a kind of collective institutional insanity, a period in which the machinery of destruction continued to operate long past any rational justification for its continued existence. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his underground bunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, issuing orders to divisions that existed only as pins on a map, refusing to consider any form of negotiated settlement, presiding over nightly situation conferences that had become exercises in collective delusion. Hitler, in these final months, was not governing. He was performing a role in a drama whose ending he had already accepted, a Götterdämmerung that he was determined to make as total as possible. The regime's ideological commitment to war, without limits, without compromise, without the possibility of capitulation, a commitment that had been its animating principle from the beginning, now ensured that the destruction would continue to the last possible moment. German cities were being systematically reduced to rubble by around-the-clock Allied bombing. The Eastern Front was disintegrating. Refugees in their millions were fleeing westward ahead of the Soviet advance, and the war machinery ground on. Partly because the regime's apparatus of internal terror, the SS, the Gestapo, the flying courts-martial that hanged soldiers and civilians for defeatism from lampposts and left their bodies dangling with placards around their necks, kept the population and the remnants of the army in a state of terrified compliance, and partly because the men at the center of the regime understood, with a clarity born of their own crimes, that they could expect no mercy from the victors. The war continued, in the end, because the men who had started it had made surrender not merely strategically unpalatable, but personally unthinkable. They had committed crimes of such magnitude: the industrialized murder of 6 million Jews, the deliberate starvation of the millions of Soviet prisoners of war, the systematic brutalization of occupied populations across an entire continent, that there was nothing on the other side of capitulation except a reckoning. And so they fought on, dragging their country and their people into the abyss with them, because the abyss was the only destination their choices had left open. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, 8 days after Adolf Hitler killed himself with a gunshot in his Berlin bunker while Soviet shells cratered the garden above his head. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and 4 months. And in that span, it had murdered approximately 6 million Jews in a program of industrial genocide that remains, 8 decades later, the defining crime of the modern age. It had ignited a war that killed between 70 and 85 million human beings, and it had left the continent of Europe in a condition of physical, political, and moral devastation that would take generations to repair, and that, in certain fundamental ways, has never been fully repaired at all. So, how did Germany lose the Second World War? It lost because it launched a war it could not sustain against enemies it systematically underestimated, based on strategic assumptions that were ideological rather than analytical. It lost because its political system, built on the Führerprinzip, on the concentration of ultimate authority in a single human will, was structurally incapable of the rational, adaptive, white institutional decision-making that a prolonged industrial war on multiple fronts demands. It lost because the very qualities that produced its early astonishing victories, speed, risk tolerance, operational audacity, the willingness to gamble everything on a single throw, became catastrophic liabilities when the character of the war shifted from a series of short campaigns to a grinding attritional contest of production, logistics, and demographic depth. It lost because ideology distorted strategy at every level of the command structure, from the grand strategic lunacy of simultaneously fighting the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States, down to the tactical insanity of holding indefensible positions because retreat was ideologically impermissible. And it lost because its enemies, for all their own inefficiencies, rivalries, and strategic blunders, managed to achieve the one thing Germany could never achieve. They built a coalition, coordinated a grand strategy, and sustained a war effort that grew more powerful over time, while Germany's grew weaker, more brittle, and more desperate with every passing season. But perhaps the deepest answer, the one that sits beneath all the operational analysis and production statistics and institutional pathology, is simply this: Germany lost because the theory of the war was wrong. Not just morally wrong, though it was that, profoundly and unforgivably, empirically wrong. The theory held that a racially superior nation, animated by a superior will and led by a singular genius, could dominate a continent and reshape the world through the decisive application of military force. The world turned out to be more complex, more resistant, more stubbornly resilient than the theory permitted. The Soviet Union did not crumble when the door was kicked in. Britain did not seek terms after the fall of France. The United States, once provoked into the fight, brought an industrial and military capacity to bear that rendered operational virtuosity irrelevant. The occupied peoples of Europe did not accept their subjugation quietly or permanently. At every point where the theory predicted a clean, decisive outcome, reality produced instead a prolonged, bloody, intractable mess, and that mess, sustained over years, exposed every structural weakness in the German system while magnifying every structural strength in the Allied one. The war that was supposed to be over in weeks lasted years. The empire that was supposed to be invincible could not defend its own borders. And the leader whose will was supposed to be the decisive force in human history ended his life in a concrete room underground, having set the world on fire and lost everything. That is how Germany lost. Not in a single battle, not through a single decision, not because of a single man's madness, though all of these played their part, but through the slow, relentless, a compounding failure of a system built on premises that the world refused to validate. The deepest tragedy of the war, and it is a tragedy, though emphatically not a tragedy for the regime that caused it, is measured in what it cost the world to administer that refusal. Tens of millions dead, cities turned to ash, entire peoples displaced, shattered, annihilated. The machine broke, as machines built on false premises always eventually break. But it did an extraordinary, an almost incomprehensible amount of damage on its way down, and the scars it left on the world have not healed, and some of them never will.